Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us on a very sunny day. We're very pleased to have you with us. Welcome to those who are still joining us. And if I could remind you of muting your mic, otherwise we will have a lot of echo. So please make sure you're muted so that we can have the best possible connection. Thank you very much. My name is Emmanuelle Labo, and I'm the director of the Aston Center for Applied Linguistics that hosts the Aston Interpreter Network. It's my great pleasure to welcome you this evening or afternoon, don't know, for our June talk of the Aston Interpreter Network. We have had quite a few requests from Aston Interpreter Network member about ethical dilemma and all those difficult issues and questions and situations that interpreters have to deal with, and often they have to sing on their feet. So we thought it would be very useful to have some guidelines to help you do that in your daily practice as an interpreter. And we've got two specialists to launch our discussion. I think they are becoming quite well known to you as my fellow organizer of the Aston Interpreter Network. So we will have first Dr. Yvonne Fowley, who has lots and lots of experience in training public service interpreters, and obviously lots of experience of sharing in their questioning about ethical dilemmas. And we have also Rekha Narula, who is a public service interpreter who is very active and obviously is dealing with this kind of question on a daily basis. So I trust that their insight will help us to start thinking about those difficult questions. As I mentioned earlier, we will record the contribution of Yvonne and Rekha, and then we will stop the recording so that everybody feels free to express their opinion and contribute to the discussion. I think I've given all the important information to get us started. So without further ado, Yvonne, I will invite you to start with your part. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Emmanuelle, and absolutely marvellous to see so many people taking time out of a hot sunny day to be with us for our discussion tonight. I'm going to talk briefly about interpreter dilemmas, and then I'm going to hand over to my colleague Rekha Narula, who's an extremely experienced interpreter in many different fields. So I'm going to dive straight in. When thinking about this talk, I asked myself, what do I mean when I use the phrase an ethical dilemma? And so I thought about what is the definition. My audio is muffled, I hear. I can't do anything about it, I'm afraid.
No. It's okay for me, sorry.
You can hear, right, okay. Right, so I thought about what is the dictionary definition of an ethical dilemma? And I was quite interested to find that this is a term that's taken from moral philosophy. And it's, according to the dictionary, it's a problem in the decision-making process between two possible options, neither of which is completely acceptable from an ethical perspective. Very interesting. But in public service interpreting, ethical dilemmas crop up very frequently, as you all will be very, very aware of that. However, they are not necessarily ethical dilemmas according to the definition that I've just given you, because dilemmas in interpreting can often, not always, but often be resolved by reference to the National Register for Public Service Interpreters Code of Professional Conduct, which we'll talk about later. So dilemmas then are not really always ethical ones, or rather, I would say they are situations in which you have a very uncomfortable choice, sometimes a very uncomfortable choice, between doing exactly what a service provider or a service user is asking you to do, which is actually contrary to the code of practice or the code of conduct, and on the other hand, the dilemma of declining to do what is being asked of you. In the latter case, you are acting professionally and pointing out to the service provider or the service user, whoever's getting you, wanting you to do this thing, that a course of action like that would be contrary to the code of conduct, the code of professional conduct. But of course, in the latter case, if you decline to carry out the wishes of the service user or the service provider, you are going to risk incurring the wrath of the service provider or the service user, entering into an argument, and perhaps being told by the service provider that you will not be engaged in future as an interpreter. Thank you very much. All your colleagues do it. Why can't you? So I'm going to ask myself another question now. Why do service providers put interpreters in this position? So service providers, we have to remember that service providers on the whole do not have any training or very little meaningful training in how to work through an interpreter. Any training they do have is usually superficial and not really provided by an expert in the field, in the subject. That means they have no idea about the limits of your role. They treat you as machines or electrical conduits. And according to their perception of what interpreting is, all interpreters have to do is to listen to the words being spoken and by some undefined and magical process, instantly transfer those words into another language. Easy, isn't it? Right, well, you all know that it's not so easy. In addition to that, service providers have very little understanding that they themselves share responsibility for communication with interpreters, and that accommodation has to be made for any interpreter mediated interaction. It is not business as usual when you have an interpreter present. And added to that is that service providers don't have realistic expectations of the interpreter. They expect them to be all sorts of things which they are not. They are not advocates, they are not culture brokers, and they are not assistants. And the status of interpreters, as you all know very well, is low, and that is commensurate with your pay. This perception of interpreters as a necessary evil comes from the historical use of untrained interpreters and unqualified interpreters who for many, many years have assumed this very informal role. Even to this day, interpreters remain underqualified and undertrained for the extremely difficult task which they have to perform. When we think about dilemmas, they crop up more frequently during interpreter-mediated interaction than they do in normal interaction without an interpreter. So you have to be prepared for them. And it is solely because there is a third party present, which makes things more complicated. The dynamics are different. So the next question I asked myself is, what types of dilemmas, what could I categorize for myself the different types of interpreting dilemmas? So I did, and I'm sure this list is not exhaustive. So did I put this on the, I think if you could show me the next slide, please, Emmanuel. Yeah. So the interpreter, the first one I thought of, the interpreter can't comply with the service provider's request for one reason or another, usually because it's against the code of conduct. Second category I thought of is that the service user divulges information to the interpreter which is not meant to be interpreted. That's another category. The third category might be that knowledge held by the interpreter about the service user from perhaps a previous meeting, but it is withheld by the service user. What do you do there? The fourth one, conflicts of interest. You suddenly discover that this person whom you didn't know anything about beforehand is a member of your family, something like that. The fifth one, let's say the service user is treated badly or in a discriminatory way by the service provider. What do you do? The sixth one I thought of is using swear words and insults. What do you do? And the next one, please, Emmanuel. Interpreting shocking or bad news is another one. And maybe family members don't want you, ask you not to interpret this bad news. The eighth one that we've come across very recently is interpreting nonsense, especially in mental health interpreting. The ninth one, being asked to divulge information about other interpreters. A service provider might say, oh, we had a colleague of yours here the other day, but she didn't seem very good. What do you think of her? The 10th one, being offered gifts and gratuities. What do you do? The 11th one that I thought of was managing your withdrawal from an assignment, because you may, at some time in the future, have to manage your own withdrawal from an assignment. And I'm sure that you can think of plenty of other categories that I haven't included there. A wide range of different situations come to mind, and these categories, they're my categories, they're not anybody else's. They could be wrong, and I'm sure that you can add to them or think of better ways of other categories that I haven't included. Okay, so a book that I have used a lot with my students when I've been working with students who've been working at the police station is a book called Active Defence, written by Eade and Shepherd, Roger Eade and Eric Shepherd. And it's written for defence lawyers who attend police stations in order to be present as defence advocates in police interviews of a suspect who are also their clients. But it doesn't matter. It could still apply to any situation in which an interpreter is involved. Eade and Shepherd describe the police interview from the perspective of the defence advocate as a continuous stream of problem solving. I think that's a wonderful phrase. It's very, very apt, because to me, this phrase exactly describes the task of the interpreter. Interpreting is in effect a continuous stream of problem solving, just like active defence work at the police station. It requires a constant state of alertness and an ability to make decisions very quickly. And quite apart from the language aspects of interpreting, which involve listening, selecting the most appropriate phrase from a range of possible options, you have to make instant decisions about the dilemma confronting you and how to handle it. But the stage before that, of course, is recognizing that a dilemma has arisen and in the first place, and then having a framework for working out what to do. Now, when I was teaching the Diploma in Public Service Interpreting in Health and in Law, I found that students were quite resentful about spending time on discussing dilemmas in interpreting, and instead they prefer to get on with their terminology lists and their word banks and their term banks and practice their role plays ready for the examination. But the dilemmas that interpreters have to confront crop up very frequently, and the less experience you have, the more difficult it is to know what to do. So you need to have a framework for working out what to do and have plenty of opportunities to discuss them in your training with fellow professionals, because you won't have that opportunity when you're actually doing an assignment. So Emmanuel, if you could just show the next slide, please. Oh, not that one, the next one. So this one is the framework that I use when I'm training my interpreters. Identifying the dilemma, listing all possible options, good and bad, list the consequences of each option, choose the appropriate option, and justify your decision using the actual words that you would use with the service provider or the service user. It sounds so easy, doesn't it? But in all the classes I've ever taught over the last 30 years, everybody has trouble with each of these 5 steps. So if you could go back, please, to the previous one, the interpreter's introduction. I really want to emphasize again, once again, I'm sure all of you are sick of hearing about this, the importance of the interpreter's introduction. And many service providers have described this to me as a statement of intent, and perhaps it should be called a statement of intent. After all, they often use a statement of intent themselves, and so why shouldn't you, as part of your job, state what your intentions are during this interpreting interaction, which is to follow. So I think that the introduction of the interpreter before there is any interpreted interaction at all, before it starts, is absolutely vital. I think it's key to reducing the likelihood of misunderstandings about the role of the interpreter that will crop up during the interaction. And the interpreter's introduction is the corollary of the statement of intent of the service provider. If we look at the elements of the interpreter's introduction, you can see that it covers every single aspect of the role of the interpreter very, very succinctly. And it covers every element of the role in a brief but very unequivocal way. And so if you look at that, there can be no doubt or misunderstanding about what you are there for. But service users and service providers often forget this as the interpreter mediated interview proceeds, and then both parties get lost, they get engrossed in it, and they forget what you said at the beginning. So timely and gentle and polite reminders to both parties in both languages are, I think, completely in order if dilemmas should crop up and you think you can solve them with the aid of the introduction. Something like, do you remember what the interpreter said about not being on anybody's side before the interview started? Or do you remember that the interpreter said that she would interpret everything that you say before the interview started? Do you remember that? Now, we've practiced this many, many times in our classes, in our training, and many students find it very difficult to refer to themselves as the interpreter because it seems formal and it seems unnatural and it seems awkward. They also find it very difficult to be brief during the intervention itself, but it's necessary to refer to yourself in this way because it wouldn't be clear who was talking, you, the service provider, or the service user, because of the need, obviously, to interpret in the first person, not in the third person. And the longer you take to explain the dilemma and solve the dilemma to the other parties, the more time is wasted and everybody forgets the thread of what they were going to say. So before I hand over to Rekha, I just want to say a few final things. It's, in my view, it's not compulsory, but in my view, highly advisable to have a printed version of the interpreter's introduction in 2 languages in front of you before any interaction begins, so that you can easily refer to it. And it's also advisable, and Rekha is going to talk about this quite a lot, it's also advisable to have the National Register for Public Service Interpreters Code of Conduct in front of you, so that you can cite the authority of the National Register if you are registered. Of course, you can only do that ethically if you are already a registered interpreter. Otherwise, you would be giving the impression that you're registered when you're not. But nevertheless, it's a useful thing to have in front of you. So finally, I'll go back to the framework that I use in my training courses, and that is the one that is devised by a group of Canadian academics, and I'm afraid I just can't remember where I found it because I've used it so often, but I probably will be able to give you the reference if I look it up. So go back to, please, Emmanuel, the next one, which is the framework. Identify the dilemma, list the possible options, good and bad, list the consequences of each option, good and bad, choose the appropriate option, and justify your decision. So that's why training in discussing interpreting dilemmas is so crucial, because you don't have time to ask a colleague. You haven't got a colleague there anyway to ask. You haven't got time to do research when you're actually in an assignment. And you haven't got time to read things up during the assignment. So it's all got to be done on the hoof. So thank you for listening to me. And I'm going to hand over to Rekha, who will explain to you some of the dilemmas that she has frequently encountered during the course of her work in the last, I don't know, is it 20 years, Rekha? More? 25 years, I think, maybe. So,
No.
So let's listen to you. Thank you.
Yes, I started when I was very young, and actually I did. I was 14 when I started interpreting. When I got my first taste of interpreting, I was 14. But that's another story for another day. It was with the UN, a branch of the UN. Anyway, as Yvonne said, thank you, Yvonne. Thank you for your presentation. Excuse me, as Yvonne said, I'm going to talk about 3 real life situations with the dilemmas that came attached with them, which I didn't anticipate, obviously, at the time. These occurred during assignments where I had no access to the internet. I couldn't phone a friend. And so, yes, and then there were, I'm going to discuss any potential consequences, solutions, and make reference to the National Register's excuse me, Code of Conduct. Emmanuel, may we start with slide 7, please? Thank you. So just for your ease of reference, it's, oops, oh, 6 even, yes, sorry, I can't count. For your ease of reference, I've put the 5-step framework on the left, and according to the 5 categories which Yvonne had mentioned in her presentation, an interpreter being left alone with the service user. So in this particular situation, I was called, I think it was one of my first police assignments many years ago, and I've been doing public service interpreting since 2001. So I was at a police station, and it was for a witness statement, and the police officer asked me to take down the witness statement whilst he and his colleague went off to do other things, as he put it. And I sort of said, well, no, very politely. And I suggested to him that, you know, this is not something I'm trained to do. So anyway, the dilemma in this case is that you are left alone with somebody who could be a victim, who could be a witness. In this case, it was a witness. And as Yvonne alluded to it or mentioned it earlier on, you're thinking, well, I'm not trained to take a witness statement or any kind of statement. What if I refuse? Will they give me more work later on? You know, and another thing, more practical as well, is what kind of questions am I supposed to be asking for this witness statement? So that's identifying the dilemma. And if you look at the five-step framework, if you list all the possible options, good and bad. So one of the options, as I said in my at the start of this, is that I said to the officer I could not be left alone with the person, and that I was not trained, unlike the police officers, in statement taking. That's one solution. Another solution could have been to take the statement by asking the officers what questions were to be asked as prompts for the witness. If we come back to step 3 of the framework, what are the consequences of these options? So if you refuse, if you object, if you protest, the officers will be unhappy with your reply, and they might, through their contacts, prevent you from getting future work. If you take the statement, then you, the untrained person, interpreter or not, you are untrained in statement taking, might miss some vital information, might miss some cues given in the replies of the witness, and which would provide a springboard for some further questions. And what if the witness or victim says something which actually would make them become a suspect? You're not trained to know that, but it does happen. What language do you take the statement in? Are you meant to translate the statement? What if the statement is taken late at night and goes on until the early hours? You know, what happens then? Are you supposed to do a translation there and then? What are you supposed to do? And if we look at point number 4, step number 4, choose the appropriate option. And the option I chose was to politely decline to take the statement. And I said that I was not trained in what they call ABE, achieving best evidence. And I could have added, although I didn't at the time, I did say the thing about ABE, but I could have added that, would they have asked me to take the statement had it been video recorded? And the justification I gave, although at the time I didn't have to hand, which I now do, a copy of the NRPSI Code of Conduct, was sections, excuse me, 5.1, 5.6, and 5.10 of the NRPSI's Code of Conduct. And in any case, it is also against the College of Policing's own instructions for an interpreter to be left alone with anyone, victim, witness, even with a suspect, especially with a suspect. And there is what they call an SOP, standard operating procedure, for taking statements, and every police officer knows this. That's the first example. The second example, thank you, Emmanuel, slide 7, was this one. Yes, I also remember this one very well. It was in a medical context in the clinic. I had been the patient's regular interpreter for quite a long time. She was HIV positive. Obviously, I was her interpreter for the continuity factor at the sexual health clinic. She had to go to another department at the hospital for clinical tests about another matter. And part of the clinical tests involved taking blood. And the patient was asked by the doctor at her initial appointment at this other clinic, and prior to blood being taken at that same appointment, whether she had any medical conditions. And the patient said she did not have any. So the dilemma here is the fact that you know she's HIV positive. And you also know from attending the sexual health clinic appointments that there is a very real risk for the person taking the blood to have what they call a needle stick injury. And by the way, it did happen to a nurse at a sexual health clinic, although it wasn't one of my cases, but it did happen. If we come to step number 2, which is listing all the possible options, good and bad. So one possible option is you say nothing, despite knowing that the person is HIV positive. Another option is you make an excuse to speak with the member of staff privately before the blood is taken. Or the third option is you wait for the patient to leave after the blood has been taken, and then you mention something. Step number 4 is to choose the appropriate option. And I chose to say nothing. And that goes to sections 3.13 and 4.3 of the National Register's Code of Conduct. And the justification for that is it is not my information to share. It is confidential information, not mine to share. The next slide, please, Emmanuel. You will see on the right-hand side that there's category 12. That's one that, because I thought of this after in discussion with the Yvonne, that it's when you're dealing with new or unknown terminology. I'm sure you can all identify with this one and the other two, obviously, but especially this one. So you identify the dilemma. So the new and unknown terminology situation can occur in any context, whether it's medical, social services, police, etc. And it's where the service providers, the other professionals, use jargon or terms you don't know or you don't understand. And the terms can include, for example, street cruising, viral load, relevant person's representative, appropriate adult. Please remember that you have to think, as the saying goes, on the hoof. You have no time to go, oh, let me check my internet. Let me phone a friend. Let me look in my... You might have your glossary. Of course, you are absolutely entitled to look at it. I carry a dictionary or glossary, depending. But sometimes terms are introduced, new terms come up. One of the trickiest things to interpret are people's titles, their job roles. That's something you won't know until the person gives their title in the assignment at the meeting. So what do you do? I haven't got a specific example here, but let's say you have street cruising. You know, without looking it up now, I want you to think how you would say it in your respective languages. And street cruising, which is, I thank Yvonne for that, is not to be confused with street racing. And it is when groups drive up and down a street in unison at the same time, usually to show off their vehicles. When Yvonne mentioned this to me, I immediately thought of what happens every summer in Knightsbridge in London, when very rich people bring their Veyrons and Lamborghini Countach and Porsche, etc., and they race up and down the streets of Knightsbridge. But that's actually not street cruising, what they do. What they do is street racing. Street cruising is they deliberately and drive their cars slowly up and down the streets of a neighborhood to show off their vehicles to one another. And this can then slow traffic down and create, traffic jam. So the consequences for this kind of, the possible solutions for this kind of situation where you're faced with terms that you don't know or are unknown to you. One possible solution is to ask for an explanation of the person who said what they said and that you didn't know or didn't understand. That's one possible solution. A second one is to give a gloss. So you kind of give a general explanation. And the final possibility is to guess at what they might mean. Yes, well, never mind. The consequences of these solutions is, if there are several people saying things that are new to you and that can happen and has happened, it will slow down proceedings. It will slow down the meeting. So that's one aspect. That's one particular consequence. If you give a gloss, you might not give the full meaning of what the term is. And if you guess, you might give entirely the wrong meaning. And that is, I don't know which one is more dangerous, giving a gloss or guessing. So what I choose to do, and I make no apologies for it, but you can do it just the once, is for the first time you hear a term you don't understand or don't know, is I ask for an explanation of the term, and then at the same time I ask the other professionals present to avoid jargon, if at all possible. And that, for me, the justification for choosing that is to say asking for an explanation is the safest decision, is the safest option, as it means you get the correct meaning and then can translate it or interpret it correctly. And within the National Register, the Code of Conduct, the sections are 5.1, 5.4, 5.5, 5.14.2, and also 5.6 and 5.7. As you can see, I kind of have my National Register Code of Conduct to hand, but the National Register, if you are a registrant, also has a concise version of the Code of Conduct. Emmanuel, I wonder if you could show those images of it's a double-sided one, and hopefully Emmanuel can put that up on the system for you. Or I can show it to you using my screen share. Oh, thank you. Excuse me.
Is it showing?
No. Oh, yes. Yes, but not the one I want.
Okay.
It's that's coming up in a minute. It's the images I sent to you.
Okay, let me
the
look for
3 photos. Otherwise, I can just show on my like that. I got it here.
Yeah, that might be easier.
Okay. So this is the concise code of conduct. It's not the best image for you to see, but anyway. So the do's and the don'ts. And talking of the interpreter's introduction, a local council, Coventry, has an interpreter, a concise version of the interpreter's introduction, a laminated version. So you have, Yvonne rightly said, you can only quote the Code of Conduct of the National Register if you are a registrant of the National Register. It is, by the way, not a membership body. It is the regulator, the voluntary regulator of national public service interpreters. But having said that, if you are not a member of the National Register, you can, if you are working for an agency, for example, they should have their own, excuse me, their own codes of conduct, which will be very similar. I also have, for example, the Chartered Institute of Linguists Code of Conduct, or Code of Professional Conduct. The ITI, the Institute of Translation and Interpreting, of which I'm also a member, as well as of the CIOL, has one. I'm also a member of the APCI, the Association of Police and Court Interpreters. They have one. So these three are the membership bodies, and there's another one called the AIT, the Association of Interpreters and Translators. I have no doubt they have their own. So you should be able to get a copy of a code of conduct and use that. And that will be your little safety net, your little safety blanket, in fact. Now, that's my presentation. I would like to ask you to look at this category 2, which is, you know, of where this example of, oh, Emmanuel is gone again. Thank you.
I think that may be clearer.
No, there's nothing on my screen so far. Hang on. No, you've. Yeah, that's what I was showing you just now. The concise code of conduct of the National Register, which is double-sided, and this is from the Coventry City Council's own interpreter presentation, introduction. Emmanuel, can we go back to that example of category number 2 of the mother?
Which one is it?
You had it up just a minute or so ago.
This one?
No, none of those. I don't want, no, none of those, no. No. It was the one you had before. Otherwise, I can share. Otherwise, I can ask the attendees to consider the scenario and what they would do. What is the dilemma they were facing?
Is that what you wanted?
Correct. Perfect. Thank you very much. This is now for you, all of you attendees, to consider. You have the context. I'll give you two minutes or so to have a think. By the way, what I forgot to add in this context, in this situation.
Any comments that you want to make? I think it's just open to the participants.
Yeah, okay.
Now,
yeah. Yeah.
Shall I stop the recording then?
Yes.
Yeah. I'd love to hear from you.